Hello everyone, welcome to today's Novedge webinar, See the Light with ForcePack 7. ForcePack added a host of new features to make it even more powerful. Stick around for the next hour, and by the end of this presentation, you'll be fully equipped to get the most from the latest version of 3ds Max's leading scattering plugin. Today's webinar presenter is Paul Roberts. Is currently producing documentation and tutorials at i2 Software. He has graduated with degrees in both animation and architecture and has been working with 3ds Max for over a decade as a 3D designer and trainer for the games, product design, and visualization industries. Now let me show you a little bit where you can find ForcePack 7 on Novedge. In fact, Novedge is changing the way designers purchase 3D software, offering more choices, more freedom, best advice, and faster service. And, it's a one-stop shop where you can get your ForcePack, your 3ds Max, vray, Corona, and everything else you may need. And now let me share Paul's screen. And so we can show you all the wonderful features of the latest ForcePack release. Take it away, Paul.
Can you see me?
We can see you.
Excellent. Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Paul. As I said, I'm the content manager at i2 Software. So if you've ever watched any of the tutorials on our YouTube page or on the website, you've probably had the misfortune of hearing my voice before. Last week, you may have seen the news that we released ForcePack 7, which was very exciting for us. It's been in development for a while. And we think it was one of the sort of most significant releases of ForcePack for a while, adding some new features that I think really make it possible to do whole new things with ForcePack. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. So I'm not going to go through too much of an introduction. I'd rather jump in and show the new features. And so I'm going to do that. So I'm going to start with what was probably the most noteworthy new feature of ForcePack, which is the ability to scatter lights. And this is a feature that's supported by vray, of course, and Corona, but also Octane and Arnold as well for those users that are using that. And you can expect more to be added in the future once those render engines support our additions to our API. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So the nice thing about how you scatter lights with ForcePack is that there's not really anything new to learn. You can just add lights now to the geometry list, which is now a bit of a misnomer, I must say, just as though they were any normal object. And then you can use the standard distribution modes that comes with ForcePack to scatter them. So we can use a path-based distribution, for example, to put them along a spline to create this kind of festoon effect. Or you could go for the more traditional image-based lighting with areas and surfaces and that kind of thing. And you could distribute lights in a kind of grid-like pattern like this, for example, which would be good for putting them on ceilings, loads of lights on ceilings, for example, but of course, fully parametric. So you can go back and change them at any point. Maybe you've been sent a file with reference markers where an architect or someone like that would like some lights, where you can use those too with ForcePack. So we can put objects on markers. And also new ForcePack 7 is the ability to scatter lights on particle effects. That's P-flow and TIE-flow with ForcePack 7 too. The other cool thing about lights in ForcePack is that you can group lights together with geometry. So you could, as we have in this case, have some sort of geometry like a lamp post, or in this case, sort of like a garden sort of lamp stick thing. And you can combine two objects together. And then you can add this group to the items list like so, and scatter both geometry and lights as though they were one. If you're a Corona user, you've got a little added bonus here because you can also use forest color as a texture map. And by doing that, you can use forest color to randomize the intensity and the tint of the lights themselves. And also, if you're a Corona user, you'll be happy to know that the light mix feature supports lights scattered with ForcePack, as you can see, or hopefully you can see here. If you're a vray user, you can still do that too, but you just need to instantiate the lights first using forest tools. And that may change in the future too. So that's our lights feature. As you can see, there's not a whole lot to learn there. They just work, just add them like you would any other object. But I did want to add that although I'm talking about lights, actually what's changed is the ability to scatter non-geometric objects in their entirety, really. So lights are the most obvious use, but you can also now scatter splines, for example. In engines that support it, you could scatter VDB. So I think in Corona, you could scatter VDBs with Forest Pack and lots of other stuff like that too. So it does really make it a much more flexible feature. Great. So we talked a little bit about Corona there, and one of the areas that Corona was a little bit behind on compared to vray was the ability to scatter and randomize and control animated geometry. I'm happy to say that in Forest Pack 7 that's changed. So in this little example, I'm going to use some sort of wheat blowing in the wind, and I've got two versions here, one of which is just a stick, which is good for previewing in the viewports, and the actual geometry itself. So all 4 of Forest Pack's randomization modes are now usable with Corona. So to demonstrate, like I say, I'm going to pick the low poly version of geometry, and this is a really good tip, by the way, if you're trying to work out your animation. Just pick something that plays back more smoothly in the viewports. The other thing I'll do, which you're seeing here, is limit the area that I'm scattering in, just temporarily, just so that you can see how it looks in the viewports first. Okay, so you can see I've got my blowing in the wind stick up there. Actually, it's got the same noise modifier on it to create the blowing effect. And then with follow geometry, the first and simplest mode turned on, you can see that all of the scattered objects just animate at the same time and speed as the original geometry. Now in the second mode, which is called random samples, this one actually just randomizes starting points along the timeline. And it does this using 2 parameters, which are time offset and count. Here, these are these 2 parameters. So the way these work is the time offset determines the spacing between the sample points along the timeline, and the count determines the number of samples. So on this timeline, we'd have a sample point, for example, of frame 0, frame 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, and so forth, and there'd be 10 of those. And those are the points at which these random grass samples will start playing. So this parameter is also used, or these parameters are also used by the next setting, which is called random from map. And what happens now is that instead of randomly starting those samples, the black and white grayscale map determines, based on the surface, when they start, right? So the first sample will be the black parts of the map, and the last sample will be the white parts of the map. And this is quite useful for creating things like wind blowing across large areas of meadow or grass and that kind of thing, which you can see here. Now, a final type of animation type that's now supported by Corona is controlled by a map. It's called frame from map. So this is a more literal interpretation of that. And basically what happens now is you set a start and an end frame. So you're sampling the first, in this case, 40 frames of animation. And then I'm going to do a literal control of that with a black and white map. So if you play this back at the moment, nothing will happen. The playback will only change when the map changes. And that's the difference between random from map. Okay, so you can see as I change my map here, and here I'm just offsetting a gradient, it's affecting directly the animation frames that are being played back. So that gives you a really fine control for things like growth animations and things like that. It's really useful for that kind of thing. So this is Corona, like I say, this is new to Corona. But the other difference here is that once again, we've added this feature to the API that other renderers use to support Forest Pack. So things like Octane and Redshift and other renderers that don't have their own API necessarily that we support, but support us, can now tap into this and should be able to add this feature in the future as well. So talking a little bit about extending the scope of features of Forest Pack into other areas that haven't been in before, I want to talk a little bit about RealTime. So there are 3 real-time engines that are going to mention that are supported by Forest Pack 7 or support Forest Pack 7. Those are Chaos Vantage, Unreal Engine, and Unity. I don't currently have a video for Chaos Vantage, but I'm sure most people have seen this fantastic real-time technology from Chaos Group, and there'll be a video on our YouTube channel with this soon. And luckily, Forest Pack supports it with very little extra work on the part of the user. So all that actually you need to do to get your scatters with Forest Pack into Chaos Vantage is just to export the whole scene as a .vr scene, just the same as you would normally. There's no need to instantiate first with Chaos Tools. No need to do anything really, just export, and it works fine. So though I haven't got a video, there wouldn't be a lot to show you in the video anyway, except me exporting something and it kind of working. What I'm going to move on to is Unreal instead. So Unreal, I want to talk about two techniques for exporting to Unreal. And here we have a little demo of Unreal. Let me just check this is at the beginning. Yeah, it is. So I want to show you how to get this same scene out into Unreal. So first thing you need is, we're not using any native Forest Pack features here to export. In fact, we're using Datasmith. So Datasmith has supported Forest Pack for a little while and supports Forest Pack 7. You need to just make sure you've got the most recent version or the version that supports the Unreal Engine version you're going into. Now, like I say, there are two ways of doing this. So I can export directly the geometry from 3ds Max, taking out, the source geometry of the scatter and exporting that directly to Unreal with materials and everything intact. Or the second way is just to export transforms and then swap the geometry in Unreal afterwards for something that's more appropriate for real time. In this first example, we'll export the geometry, and I'm exporting these tree stumps that I've scattered around. So you just go to the export menu and you just want to pick the Unreal Datasmith option from the export menu. I'm changing it to selection here so I don't export the whole scene, but just what I have selected, and hit export. And that's pretty much that. It just takes a little while to export depending on the complexity of your not scatter, but the number of objects in your scatter, and maybe the number of Forest Pack objects you've scattered to. So now I've done that, I can just export that that Datasmith file into Unreal. I'll just choose where to save it, what folder in the asset browser to save it into. And then I'm going to bring up the import options. And generally speaking here, I leave generate light maps off here because I'm not baking into scatters. You can, but it would, take a while. And I'm turning off lights, cameras, and animations too because I don't need them. And once you've done that, you can just hit import and it will bring in your scatter just as it was in 3ds Max. So it's bringing in, as you know, with Datasmith, it converts textures, vray and corona textures to Unreal format textures and everything else. So what's actually happened here is that it's created the object in the scene here, and you can see that it's got this thing called a hierarchical static mesh component here. And it's got one of these for each of the source objects that was originally in 3ds Max. So I've got quite a few here. And what this shows you is, if we come down a little bit where it's a static mesh, what it shows you is the source geometry and then all the instances in the scene where that's used. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Now you can swap the geometry still, like I just did there, just by plugging in a new asset, sorry. So that's easy enough. And you can do that as often as you want. So you can, although you're not stuck with the object you originally imported, you can easily change them even in this version. But there is something to bear in mind, which is that because it shows the number of instances in the UI, if you do import, say, 20,000 instances, the UI is going to try and list them all. And generally speaking, that's a bad idea, and it can crash Unreal. Now, that's not because Unreal can't display the geometry. It's just because Unreal's interface is having to contain 10,000, 20,000 objects, so it crashes. So I'm going to show you another way to do this. By exporting these ferns, which also illustrates exporting using bounding boxes instead of the actual geometry. And what you need to do first of all is to tell the Unreal Datasmith plugin to export just the bounding boxes, so not to export the geometry. And the way that you do that is to add this Datasmith attributes modifier to the source geometry, not to the Forest Pack object, but to the objects that Forest Pack scatters, just to be clear on that. And this is a modifier that will be present whenever you've installed the Datasmith exporter. So it's a part of the Datasmith exporter already. And basically what you do is apply it to all the source objects. And then at the bottom here, you can see it says export geometry as bounding box. And you just want to change it to that mode. That means the actual geometry won't be exported. Now, if you've got a big scatter, that can be a tedious thing to do with loads and loads of source geometry. So there is another way of doing it, which is to use a script, which we provide on our forum, which is this Forest Pack Toolbox script. And this contains loads of handy little tools for working with Forest Pack. You can see it here. Part of that is this little Datasmith part here. And you can see that Basically, I can choose the mesh type and I can click on the add modifier button, and it will automatically find all the source objects for the forest packs that I have selected and add that modifier for you automatically. So that can save you quite a lot of time. Then you export it as usual. So we'll just export these ferns out and then come back into Unreal. Then you import them as usual using Datasmith. And what you end up with is just these boxes. Now, unlike those stumps where there weren't too many instances, there are tens of thousands of these ferns, I think. So you would struggle to select this component up here without the UI freezing. So we need to find another way of doing it. And that's what I'm doing here. So what I've got is a second content browser at the bottom here. And on the left-hand side, I've got my original bounding boxes that have been imported by Datasmith. I want to replace one with the other. So what I'm going to do, just to be non-destructive, is I'm going to copy one of these ferns over into my other folder. So I've got my fern here now, and I've got the bounding box that you can see in the viewport. I'm going to select the fern, and I'm going to select one of those bounding boxes, and then I'm going to right-click on it, and I'm going to go to Asset Actions, and here I want to go to Replace References. This brings up both those objects, and you select the one you want to keep. So I want to keep the ferns, so I'll select the ferns. Once you've done that, you click Consolidate Assets, and you'll find that the bounding box will disappear from the asset browser and the viewport or the scene, and it will be replaced by the fern instead. And you can just go through and you can do this to all the assets you wish to replace. And of course, you can do this as many times as you want. So if you later want to change that fern for something else, not a fern, maybe a bush or a tree or something else, you can easily do that too. So you can see that that works relatively smoothly there. The reason for doing that, I would say, and it's a good way to work, is that generally speaking, just taking a single mesh out of 3ds Max is probably not going to be as optimized for real time as it could be. So it makes a lot of sense, or it certainly did for my scene in this case, to replace it with a fern that was designed for real-time use, which has level of detail, which has the wind animation baked into it, and all these other sort of nice features that Unreal supports. And you get far better performance that way too, with that particular asset anyway. So that's Unreal. The other big thing that we did with Forest Pack 7 was we've introduced support for Unity. And we've done this ourselves. So we have a plugin that you need for Unity, you need to install for Unity, and we use it in conjunction with Forest Tools to export files that can then be loaded using our plugin. I'll show you how this is done. So there are basically three parts to this. The first part is going to be exporting, the second part is going to be installing the plugin, and the third part is going to be importing again. So that was a little preview. Here we go. So here I'm going to export these trees. So what I'll do is I'll go over to Forest Tools over here in the Utilities panel. You can also access it from the top toolbar. Click on that. I'm going to go to Forest Exporter, click Open. And now we have, and this is the only thing you need to do here, is change this format drop-down to Unity, like so. And you don't need to change anything else. Just choose where you want to save the exported file, and then click Save. Okay. Once you've done that, this will export an FBX file containing the source objects, and it'll export a .forest file which contains all the transform information as to where those should be placed in Unity. You need both those files. So once you've done that, you open up Unity, and you're going to need to install our Unity importer package. Now, that will be on the Unity Asset Store very soon. At the moment, you can download it from our forum or website. Okay, so to install it, you just drag it in and click Import. It's easy enough to do. Once you've done that, you are ready to import your scatter. So the trees and the FBX, the FBX and the forest file, as you saw there, just drag them in, and they're just importing. Once you've got it in there, you can see a preview of the FBX, and the one with the little forest pack logo, that's the actual scatter. You can see a preview of that too. We'll just drag this into our scene, and you can drag it into the sample, the kind of scene view there, the hierarchy view there, and it pops it into place. If you needed to, you could reset the position, rotation, scale, but here it went in okay. Now, if I want to edit the materials with Unity, I have to go to the Materials tab and extract the materials into the asset browser. Now I've got my materials here ready to be edited. The other thing you can do is to just drag materials onto the remapped materials part of the object too. So that's easier if you've got pre-made materials. You just want to replace basically what was on the original. That's pretty much it. That's how the Unity export works so far. So the Unity exporter is still a beta feature, I would say. So we're still actively developing this, and so you can expect improvements, and please give us any feedback as you're using it, because that would be really helpful to know what you like and what you don't like and how it can be improved and so forth. Great. So next up, I want to talk a little bit about the library browser in ForestPack. So the library browser has been in ForestPack for a while, and in ForestPack 7, although it looks quite similar to how it used to look before, it has in fact been completely rewritten from scratch. So the UI has been updated a bit, but the most important thing is that it's a much more adaptable platform now, so that we can add more exciting things to it in the future. But we have also in this version added some features thanks to this rewrite that we couldn't have done previously. And the most significant of those is the ability to import objects to a library from the scene. So here, for example, I have an empty populate library, and I'd quite like these trees to be in this library. This would have been quite a laborious process before, but now all I need to do is to right-click and select Import Objects. And it brings up my Import Objects dialog here, which has a few options. Now I'm going to go through these, but for the most part, you can actually leave them alone. But first of all, you have got create a 3ds Max scene. So what's going to happen is it's going to take those objects and it's going to export them to a Max scene in the library location. And you can rename it here. And if you accidentally rename it to something, a file that already exists, it will take care of that for you too. If you want to give it a name, you can. You've also got the ability to extract the materials off of the objects and place them in a separate material file. Now, it will also save the materials onto the objects, but this can be useful if you're planning to make a library that has support for multiple render engines, for example. So you can do that. You can rename it something more meaningful if you want to. This is a really important one. Obviously, all the textures and so forth that are used on those assets need to be kept neat and tidy and findable in the future. So what this option does is it takes all those assets and it puts them in a specific folder in the library location rather than wherever else on your hard drive they were. And finally, you can create thumbnails. Now, these aren't rendered thumbnails. They're captured from the viewport, but they're usually good enough to give you an idea of that model. So I'm just going to click Import, and you'll see this run through and quickly add those to the library. Now, that certainly would have taken a lot longer in the past. It's not restricted to individual objects either. You can do presets. So here I have a grass preset that I like, and I've made this grass, and I'd like to use it in future scenes. So rather than kind of take all the individual blades of grass into the library, I'm going to take the whole preset so I can reuse it. And you do it in the same way, just import it. And there you go, you get a grass preset. And now I can reuse that in a whole new scene just by selecting it from the library and pasting it in. So it's a very easy way of saving handy forest scatters, whole scatters that you've used before. So that was how to create, and just to go into this in a little bit more detail, that was how to add objects to an existing library. But what if you haven't got that library yet and you want to start from scratch? Just want to show you that that's not a much more complicated process. So here I've got really quite a few flowers I'd like to add to a brand new library in a brand new location. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this preferences option at the top of the library browser, and I'm going to create a new location on my hard drive for that. Now, if you're in a studio, this could be a network location. So you could be creating this library somewhere on a network so that other users in the studio could access that too. I can give this any name here in this name tab, and that will be what displays in the items tree. So if I close this, you'll see it on the left there now as Unreal assets. These were low poly assets exported from Unreal. I can now create a library. So I right click on that and hit create library and give it a name. So this is my new library, and now I can just go through that same process again of hitting import objects. Don't touch any of those, don't need to touch any of them, of course you can. and then it imports everything, really quite a few objects, building a library very fast until it's done. Okay, so you can see that was the entire process from start to finish of creating a new library in ForestPak's new content browser. So we have some more plans for this, but we'll show you those in the future. There are a couple of other little things we've added, like the ability to select multiple objects by holding down Control and click ranges, and sort of like Windows Explorer does, but you can do it in the content browser now. And also the ability to use sort of Boolean searches, so the search has been improved as well. So that makes sense because we assume people are going to probably spend a lot more time or going to create their own more user libraries than they have done previously. So good search is going to be even more important. Good. So talking of libraries, with every sort of major ForestPak release, we generally like to add new content as well, new assets. So we have 2 new collections in this release. You know, I always say that I think if you were to buy these collections separately, they would probably cost you near the price of a license of ForestPak anyway. And ForestPak already comes with some quite a bit of content. So, you know, I think it's good value for money, but then I'm biased. So the first thing is we have some photo scanned tree stumps. So it's obviously very common for us to scatter trees, but any glance at any kind of managed woodland will show you that most of the time trees are very carefully managed, and trees fall down, and then, you know, you're not going to get a believable looking forest without some stumps. So what we have here is this new stumps library, and you can see we've got them in various sizes. And again, we can use this control click to pick a few if we want to start a new scatter. So I'm just showing you some basics of scattering here. We've got materials, a wider range of materials support than usual. So we've got F-Storm in there now, as well as Arnold and Octane, and then the usual suspects, vray and Corona, of course, as well. And then when you're done, you just hit load selected. So just load these stumps in. So this is creating a new scatter from nothing. And then all you'd need to do is to sort of pick the surface to apply those stumps. And okay, that's far too many stumps. So you just adjust the density a little bit to spread them out. Don't forget to turn on rotation and scale randomization to hide repetition, and you're good to go. So the other thing you can do, of course, is to add stumps to an existing scatter. So you can open the same library browser from directly inside ForestPak. And that's quite useful. Again, you might have chosen all your trees and created a nice scatter, but then you just want to add a few stumps to it just to make it a little bit more realistic. There's also presets. So that was loading and choosing individual stump objects, but there are also these pre-made presets like the grass that we saw earlier, where we've already made some selections of stumps for you with some recommended distribution settings. So all you really need to do is just pick those and then just click on a surface or a spline, and sort of takes care of it for you. The other thing about the presets, and this is why I used them in Unreal earlier, is they're slightly more optimized than the individual stumps. So they're about I think a quarter of the resolution, and they use 1K maps. So they're a little bit less memory intensive than picking the individual stumps. Of course, less detailed for close-ups. So that's the trade-off. If you're just creating huge areas or you're doing aerial shots or something like that, you might want to use the presets instead. So that's our first library. Our second library is cut hedges. So this library contains, I think, 89 cut hedges in total. There are 10 species, and they're in 5 height variations for the linear hedges. It's from about 0.5 meters to 2.5 meters, so a good range. There's also topiary presets, which we'll come to in a second. Now, these work using a spline. So here I've just drawn a spline I'd like my hedge to follow. It won't deform the geometry, so you have to be careful about how you create that spline. But apart from that, you can curve it within reasons. So you basically open the library, pick your hedge. I'm in icon mode here because you can't just pick that spline. It's a different distribution mode. So I draw an icon into the scene. I'm going to go over to the modify panel, and I'm going to go to distribution, and you'll see this is in a different distribution mode than usual. It's in path mode. So all I do is click on plus, and I will select the splines from the scene that I want to generate a hedge. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So using that, you can very quickly create these cut hedges in your scene, which I hope will be really useful for people. There's another type of hedge, as I mentioned, which are these topiary hedges. So this is for creating any shape of hedge rather than a simple square box hedge. So with these, you can make the hedge the shape of any surface, really. So rather unrealistically, I'm going to put them on this Forest Pack 7 text here, but just to illustrate. So first of all, I don't want to see that mesh in the final render, so I'll hit turn off renderable. So that's the first thing. And the other thing is that these hedge topiary things, they use the UVW maps to control the distribution. So I've set them up with real world map size, but you can change the density by changing the UV map, so easy enough. Next up, you would create a Forest Pack object and load up a hedge. And then all you need to do is change it to generate mode and select the hedge, and you'll get an instant topiary hedge on that object. Like so. Easy as that. If you had multiple topiary objects in the scene that you wanted to use, no need to attach them together. Just go to the surfaces rollout and add them as separate objects. Like that. Okay. So you can see you can create straight box hedges and topiary hedges very, very easily. That was just a reminder that there's Stumps, which you've just seen. We're also about to add all the samples from the 3D garden as easy to access assets directly in Forest Pack. So rather than having to download them one at a time, you'll have access to all the free samples from the 3D garden the next time you update Forest Pack. That's not quite there yet, but it should be. They should be released soon, in the next few weeks, say. So we're moving now onto a couple of the sort of usability improvements that make kind of day-to-day life just that little bit nicer. And I'm going to start with some new modes for selection or for starting a new Forest Pack scatter. And you might have spotted them in some of the other screenshots. So let's say, for example, we've got this lake in front of us and we want to scatter some lilies, two objects here. Normal thing would be to create a Forest Pack object, add those to the items list, then scatter and so forth. But we've got a new mode now called populate from selection. And basically this is kind of a two-click scatter. So you select your objects, you have this mode turned on, then you can, in generate mode, select the spline, and it's kind of done it for you. Okay, so select objects, generate, click a spline or a surface. Then you might need to change the distribution, but it certainly is a time saver. Another way of selecting multiple objects once you've created a Forest Pack object is now to use the lock the stack option here. So I've locked the stack. So Forest Pack's UI is still showing. I've picked my objects. Now I'll just click on the plus button. All three objects get added, and then I can select a forest object and unlock the stack again. So that's a quicker way of doing that. Another handy thing, and this was something that bugged me for years and years actually, when you click to add a new item to the geometry list, the custom object button wouldn't be selected automatically. So you'd always have to go in and pick it, and I would always forget and select the object instead. So in Forest Pack 7, when you add a new object, the custom object picker is automatically activated. It seems like a small thing, but I think it's saved me so much time already, that particular option. So there's a couple of little things there. I just wanted to mention before we go to a more significant change, I think that again can save people a lot of time. So like I would say that most people are probably, if you're doing foliage and things, are probably scattering trees from vendors rather than materials you've made yourselves, trees with materials you've made yourselves and that kind of stuff. And often those materials may not be quite the right color match for your scene. They might be too saturated or too desaturated or slightly too light or too dark. And to go in and color correct those, you know, the maps on plants can often be quite complex. The material, sorry, shader networks can often be quite complex. So what we've added in Forest Pack 7 is a way to color correct all the assets in a scatter from one place. I'm going to illustrate just by scattering these stones. And there are a lot of stones, separate stone objects in this scene. I may not look it, but there are a lot. So these are our color correction options, which are now in the materials rollout of Forest Pack. And what you can do with these is to basically control the hue, the saturation, and the brightness. So I'm going to do an IPR render here so we can see this in real time. And what I'm going to do is just shift the hue ever so slightly, for example, just to illustrate that. I get a little bit more yellowy, orange. And then I'm going to change the brightness a little bit too, just to make it a little bit brighter, and I'm going to change the saturation. You can see I've color corrected those stones so that they much better match that surface texture that's underneath them. Now, and I've done that all from one interface, even though there are like 50 different stones in this particular scene. The other thing that you can do, for example, here I'm going to color correct the trees, is that you can control a hue range to effect. So, for example, I might want to color the leaves of these trees, but not the trunk and not the kind of pine cones that are on there. So I can fix that by turning on apply to hue range and picking just a range that matches the color of the leaves, and then it leaves everything else well alone. And that's really handy, so you don't really need to go in and start fiddling with the materials that you don't want to affect. Now, an important thing to note is that this uses forest color behind the scenes to create these color correction effects. So you do need to have forest color maps assigned to your diffuse inputs. So if you haven't done that, again, it might think, well, I've got to go through now and add forest color maps to every one of my shaders. That's going to take ages. But there is this optimize materials button in the materials rollout. And this is, you know, this has been here a while actually, but it has the ability to apply forest color maps here, and it will go through and do it automatically to every object that's in this forest scatter. We've also updated this now. This video actually doesn't have that, but we've also updated it for those materials that use translucency maps. Generally speaking, you'll get more accurate results if you apply a forest color map to the translucency too. So there's now an option to also add forest color materials or maps, sorry, to translucency inputs as well. Let's move on. If none of that's working for you and you still need to turn off color correction for individual maps, you do still have that option in the forest color maps. You can see there's a tick box there that says apply color correction, and you can just turn that off, no problem at all. Great. So another sort of useful change is one of the, again, less well-known distribution modes perhaps of Forest Pack, which is the reference mode. So what the reference mode allows you to do is, just click that on, is to basically, we saw it earlier with the lights actually, you change to reference mode and you've got two ways of using this. So you can either assign an object to the pivot point of a number of separate items. Here I've got these text items that are called Stump, or you can use mesh faces, right? So every triangle in a mesh can take a separate object, and you can use them that way too. So it's this part that's been improved. So what I can do, or the improvements are that I can now randomize the position, which can break up any kind of regular grid that you're finding in these modes. So I can turn that on and off and randomize position, but perhaps more significantly, I can now choose to scatter multiple items per face. So you can increase the number of items without increasing the resolution of the source geometry if you're using this kind of mode. You can also, which you couldn't do before, limit by material ID. So I can now limit to only use parts of the source mesh based on their material IDs, which again makes this a much more flexible way of scattering on things. You have, of course, got the other surface modes, but in some scenarios, this is can provide an alternative way of doing things, especially with data that you've been sent from other people. Moving on, we've got a couple left. So one of the other parts of Forest Pack that we've just seen that I think adds a lot of value to using the plugin is Forest Color, which allows you to randomize the bitmaps on trees or anything else that you scatter with Forest Pack. But it also allows you to randomly tint items using a gradient, or even randomly tint based on sampling a pixel color from a map, or even pull the color off of a surface and use that to tint an object. So Forest Color Map has been changed so that actually a lot of those features still work even when forest color, or even when the items are no longer in a forest object because they've perhaps been instantiated. So here you can see a Forest Color Map is being used to tint this grass, right? So there's a map on the surface that's being used to tint this grass here, so that it's just a little bit more realistic because it isn't the same color going across the whole area. Now, normally, if you were sending this grass, you can see it's on an undulating surface, to someone without Forest Pack, but maybe they did have Forest Pack Lite, normally this wouldn't work because, as you may know, Forest Lite doesn't support non-planar surfaces. It only works with flat areas. So what you would normally have to do is instantiate this, so turn this object into loads of individual objects using and just native max instances, basically. But in doing that, you would lose this forest color feature because it needs to be in Forest Pack to work. So that is what's changed. So this now will work whether it's in Forest Pack or not. So if I go through and instantiate this, so I'll turn this into max instances using Forest Tools, the same tool we used to export to Unity earlier, and then hit render again. Now that kind of information is baked into those instances and it can be reproduced even though this is no longer technically a Forest Pack scatter anymore. So this would render fine with Forest Pack Lite. So it's useful for working with people. But another big change is that actually for some features, the object never needed to have ever been in Forest Pack. So these crayons, for example, they weren't scattered and have never been scattered with Forest Pack. They were just individually placed along a spline here. So what I can do now with Forest Pack Color is that I can use that to colorize those crayons. And rather than have to type in or select a load of colors manually, I can use this handy feature that lets me randomly pick a sample from a map. So I've got a picture of some crayons. I'm just going to plug that into the color tint map input, and I'm going to turn on tint override basically and random values there. So it's randomly sampling a color from that map there. And you can see that's working really well. I've also got blending mode. So at the moment it's in color mode, but these are blending modes like Photoshop. So if I switch it to normal mode, it will display the pure color that's being sampled from that map rather than blending it with the color that's selected up here, which was just white. See how easy that was just to pick some colors from a map. So that's, that's works in the light version too. So if you download the light version, you kind of basically get this kind of free new map type as well that can be useful for all kinds of things. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about some of the other usability improvements in Forest Pack. So some of the small things that just make day-to-day life that little bit nicer. So this one was requested quite a few times by vray users. Previously, vray had problems using object ID render passes with Forest Pack. So that's been changed. And now to use this feature, all you need to do is to give an item, the source item, a gbuffer ID, and then add the vray object ID, and then hit render. And then you can see it's working, which is great. Also supports CryptoMat, so that's good. We've also got this, let me just pause that for a second to talk about this one. We've got this new mode. I mean, anyone who's used Forest Pack for a while will know that it is a really fully featured plugin, but having so many features comes at a cost to the user interface. So there are a lot of rollouts and sometimes going up and down through them and opening and closing them repeatedly can be a little bit of a time suck. So what we've got now, a little bit similar to Lightroom, is the ability to just open a single rollout at a time. And if you basically go into the settings and turn on open single rollout mode, what will happen now is that when you close one rollout, it just closes all the others. And that can just help you to navigate around that little bit quicker and save a bit of time, like so. Another change is the way that we're handling multiple splines. So you can see this is Forest Pack 6. And here in Forest Pack 6, you can see when using multiple splines, the height of all the scatters is always the highest of the include areas. Right, so you can see that there, and that's okay. But if you just wanted to use areas to create like stepped area, then that wouldn't work in Forest Pack 6. Whereas in Forest Pack 7, each individual area, its position on the z-axis is respected basically. So this is useful because it means that you can use multiple splines without necessarily needing to add a surface if you had sort of a tiered up kind of scatter or something like that, for example. And also, again, this works in Forest Pack Lite. So this makes Forest Pack Lite just that little bit more useful. Another thing that's useful is the support really for these new map types that were added by vray and Corona in the last few iterations. So this is vray here, but they've recently added a couple of things, which is vray multimaps, which could be randomized by instance ID, and vray UVW randomizer, which can kind of randomly rotate and change the tiling and so forth of your textures. And that's really useful because you could really disguise repetition and get a lot more out of your textures using these two plugins. But previously these didn't work with Forest Pack, so Forest Pack 7 now means that happens. If you look at these tiles here, you can see the tiles, the texture is obviously repeating on these first two tiles here. So by turning on instance ID on this UVW randomizer, you can see that's immediately started shuffling those around. And then if I do the same thing for the vray multimap, which here I'm just tinting it actually, you can do something with that too. So to a certain extent, that is of course similar features to Forest Color, but a different way of doing things. Another thing that's new is we've kind of streamlined a little bit the camera rollout. Now actually this was done so that batch rendering was more reliable when you were switching between camera views, but generally speaking it just makes life a little bit easier now. So you can see that basically you don't have to pick cameras, you can automatically switch between views and it updates automatically. Now, and personally, I actually would not generally leave this working in the viewports because it can make your viewport performance quite slow if it's constantly updating the scatter every time you move the camera. So the real benefits are at render time. And there is an option down here that says enable in viewport if you want to turn it on in the viewports. There are only certain scenarios in which I would recommend that. Yeah, that's just down there, enabling viewport. Great. And that's pretty much it. There's just a couple of last things. So here we have Forest Pack 6 scattering on an animated surface, and how clearly that's coming out, but you can see the scatter is popping here and there. It's not consistent throughout the animation, so not really usable actually for animation, really. So in Forest Pack 7, that's been really radically improved. So here's the same animation, and you can see those little sticks on this animated surface are staying attached where they should, which allows you to do some fun stuff like, you know, dancing hedge guy like this. In Forest Pack 7, these little bits of hedge would be flying around all over the place. 6, sorry. In Forest Pack 6, these bits of hedge would be flying around all over the place. In 7, they work as you'd hope they would. And that kind of brings me to the end of my little presentation on some of the new features of Forest Pack 7. I left 10 minutes for questions. So I don't know if there have been any questions in the chat, or if you want to ask any now, then please do.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Yeah, we're sticking around a few minutes for a question. This is your chance to, you have the best, and Paul today really delivered. Thank you, Paul. I don't see questions yet, so if you don't mind, I'm going to transition to my screen for the time being, and I'll turn it back if we need to, just to show everybody where they can find Forest Pack 7 at novedge.com. And as I said before, you can find vray, you can find Corona, 3ds Max, and Novedge is a one-stop shop, best price guarantee, and excellent customer service. I don't see any question, Paul. So what I'm going to also remind everybody is that I've been recording the presentation, and if you want to watch it again, share with friend colleagues, you can do so by going on our YouTube channel. Just search for Novedge. Thank you again, Paul. I know it wasn't the easiest presentation with the internet going a little slow, but you really, really knocked it out of the ballpark. Oh, wait. I have a question.
Excellent.
So the subscription ends after the year, and I think I can, the subscriptions are annual. So, right, Paul, to confirm?
Yeah, well, they're not subscription. I just want to be clear about that. Okay. They're not subscriptions. So if you buy Forest Pack, you have Forest Pack forever. It's a maintenance.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so you pay to you renew to get new versions and new content and that kind of thing, but not your version of Forest Pack that you have won't stop working.
Oh, great. And can you set an animation to start at specific points per color or of a map?
For what? Sorry, for.
Can you set an animation to start at specific points per color of the map?
Yeah. So yes, by clever sort of mapping. So you can use a map to drive the animation. So in that case, you would just have to animate the map in order to control the animation when you want it to start, when you want it to stop, and so forth. The other thing you could do is you could use the offset animation map combined with moving the animation along the timeline a little bit, so you can kind of control it that way. Maybe this needs a tutorial, thinking about it. But I mean, yes, you can control animations with maps. I think if that's the question, you can control animations with maps. So there's basically two ways. One of them is just it controls the offset, so the animation is permanently playing, and you control the offset using a black and white map. The other way is to absolutely control the exact frame with a map. So you would basically say, I'm going to animate this particular object. The animation is on frame 0 to 100. And then you animate a map where the color black is frame 0 and the color white is frame 100. And you can animate the map to control the animation within that range. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Paul. I think that's it for questions. And oh no, one more. What about those spline one over another?
Those splines one over another. That's a good question. I would have to test that. It should work. It should work because they're separate. If they're separate splines in the areas list, even if they were on the same level, normally you would get one spline on top of the other. So if they were sub splines of the same object, one would be seen as the inner one would be an exclude and the outer one would be an include, right? But if they're separate splines in the areas list, two separate splines, not sub splines, then they should work separately. So that should work. Having said that, I haven't tested it.
Okay.
So in theory, yes.
Honesty. All right. I think this was really it, Paul. Thank you so much again. Yeah. Watch the recording on YouTube, search for the Novedge channel, and a great rest of the day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you.